I am Joanna Lee Williams, and I'm an assistant professor here in the Curry School of Education at UVA in Applied Developmental Sciences, and I'm really excited to be part of this conference. And before I start talking about our panel, I just want to take a moment to thank not just Patrick Tolan, but also some of the behind-the-scenes people, including Ellen Daniels and Crystal Hayslip, and the team of volunteers who's been helping out. Good, so I like that we have a little energy towards the end of the day, and I think we'll be really energized by the end of our panel discussion today. We've actually jam-packed our panel here with a bunch of great individuals. The focus of this afternoon's panel is on youth as engaged citizens, and I think that title in and of itself really embodies the positive youth development perspective of considering youth as assets and as contributors. And I think it's no coincidence that many of our panelists were actually featured in the slide presentation that Rich Lerner did this morning. So I think it's a timely talk, and it connects right back to what we talked about or how we began the day this morning. As someone whose work is branching into this area with the generous support of Youth-Nex and Patrick, I'm very excited to hear what they have to share with us this afternoon. Just to give you a brief overview, we're going to begin with Reed Larson and Jessica Armstrong, who are going to share with us their perspective on cognitive skills that youth need for civic engagement and community organizing, and how they develop those skills. Next, Connie Flanagan will talk about civic and volunteer program components that facilitate working across difference and increased civic commitment. Then we will have Benkirchner and his collaborators talking about critical civic inquiry for youth and what high school students need to succeed. And finally, we will wrap up with Jonathan Zaff, who's going to talk about civic engagement for disconnected youth, what's unique about engaging this group, and why we should focus on them. So I'm going to introduce Reed Larson, who is a professor in the Department of Human and Community Development and in the departments of psychology, educational psychology, kinesiology, and recreation, sport, and tourism at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His current primary interest is adolescents' experiences in community-based programs, extracurricular activities, and other structured voluntary activities in the after-school hours, and you can read about some of his other accomplishments in the program. He is joined by Jessica Armstrong, who is currently the project coordinator for the Pathways Project, which is a new longitudinal study on youth development in out-of-school time programs. So let's welcome them.
Okay, so I think we're going to come like way from out here, way out in right field. Feel like a different reality after talking about car crashes. The youth, we're going to talk about our living, breathing, thinking people with deep capacity for compassion. But let me start someplace else. The paper we got on our doorstep this morning, disasters strain FEMA's resources, states limit hospital stays, Americans are pumping 5 billion tons of CO2 per year into the atmosphere. The U.S. faces serious problems, and as we speak, super PACs are raising billions of dollars to influence the 2012 federal elections. So positive development, as Rich said, entails more than individuals avoiding risky behavior, achieving mental health, positive relationships, and paying jobs. Our society desperately needs a new and next generation with the commitment and civic skills to address our dire problems and to revitalize our democracy. We need some positive development at all levels. We need citizens with expertise to work for community and societal change. So we're going to focus on the skill dimension of civic development. Volunteering and voting are good, but they're not enough. And I should say our work is at an early stage, exploratory, that we haven't had $300 million of NIH money in it, so by last session standards, we don't know anything about it. What we're going to ask is, what are the action skills youth need to develop to work for social change? And these are difficult skills. And how do young people develop them? and we're examining community-based youth leadership and civic programs as context for these questions. But we decided first to ask what skills are identified as crucial in the adult literature on civic action. We think developmentalists should more often ask what skills are really needed in adulthood. I mean, we need more Robert Garcias, right? How do you fight for free space, for open space for children in Los Angeles and actually have success? So let me introduce my colleague and very able project coordinator, Jessie Armstrong. She has a background in public policy, and she dug into the literature on advocacy and community organizing to see what experts in those fields identified as crucial civic action skills.
So what skills do youth need to develop in order to become civic agents and social change agents? The literature in advocacy and community organizing really describes a whole toolbox of skills and techniques to run an effective action campaign. So I looked at the writings of organizers like Rinku Sen, Executive Director of the Applied Research Center, Gary Delgado, the co-founder of the Center for Third World Organizing, as well as scholars like Robert Fisher at the University of Connecticut and Harry Boyd at the Center for Democracy and Citizenship. Some of the skills that are described include skills for issue development and framing the problem, which is, of course, the skill set that the press has been faulting the Occupy Wall Street organizers for neglecting. Skills and techniques for training and coaching novice members so that they understand the root causes of the problem they're working on without indoctrinating them. Basic planning skills, which Reed is going to discuss today. Skills for and methods for negotiation, both within the action group itself as well as with gatekeepers, other collaborators, and the target audience, people that you're trying to influence. And a very critical set of communication skills, skills for getting your message out and for communicating with the media. And within that skill set, there's knowing and communicating with your target audience, which I'm going to say more about. So each of us is going to dig a little more deeply into one of these skill sets and how youth develop them in programs. And Reed's going to start with basic planning skills.
Thank you, Jessie. So basic planning skills. In the adult organizing literature, one of the key terms is strategizing. Civic action is like chess. Effective community organizers think ahead, evaluate alternative strategies, weigh risks, anticipate what can go wrong, and try to strategize plans ready for every possibility. Effective planning requires creative foresight. The experts Jessie discussed often illustrate these strategic skills with examples where they failed to use them. And we go on with all the examples, and I'm sure you have these where you're trying to get something done and you forgot to think about this and you forgot to think about that. Vital to planning and strategizing are skills for brainstorming and critiquing, often done in a group, I should mention, for the prior group, to try and create an airtight plan. So how do youth learn skills for planning and strategizing in youth programs? These skills are more complicated than it might seem. Now, researchers who study the development of planning, including Larry Steinberg, typically use structured problems like the Tower of London, where the task is defined and correct answers are clearly identifiable. This involves where there's like 3 or 5 posts and you have these donut-like rings, and your task is to move the rings to a defined position. And the findings are great, really important, yet planning in the real world involves unstructured problems. You're dealing with an animated task environment, fluid rules, ambiguity, and shifting targets. Requires dynamic thinking. There is not one right solution. You're often feeling in the dark. Now, pre-adolescents can't do this type of planning very well. Todd Little found that pre-adolescents have magical thinking about how their plan will inevitably lead to the desired outcome. They don't imagine all the unexpected and perverse things that can intervene. Early adolescents, and this is telling, equate planning with daydreaming, with whimful rather than methodical thinking. They have limited abilities to think systematically about the causal ordering of human events. It's only in mid-adolescence that kids begin to become able to do this. They can begin to develop a sense of future time as an arena for planning, for ordering steps, and they can develop abilities for reasoned foresight. But these skills don't develop automatically. They depend on having experiences within the pertinent domain of activity. Now, in our research with 6 high-quality youth leadership programs, teens reported learning this skill set for planning and strategizing, whether conducting social action campaigns or sometimes just planning a party for their peers. They described learning to anticipate all the things that could go wrong, anticipate contingencies, use if-then thinking. I always have a backup plan. So they learn these basic skills to brainstorm plans and critique them. And in our longitudinal interviews, they later reported transferring these skills to their schoolwork, planning for the future, and engaging in new action campaigns. So how do they learn this? Our research, and that by others, suggests they learn this, first of all, by some coaching from older youth and adults, also through Bandura's modeling. Now, that's not imitating others, it's trying to figure out how the heck that adult did that. And third, and maybe most importantly, by doing it from trial and error. But it wasn't just random trial and error, it was reasoned experimentation, often done as a peer group, sometimes individually, but often as a peer group. They analyze together, and they learn from experimentation, testing out hypotheses, and then evaluating how they worked. Benkirchner reports how some of the best adult leaders begin the program with teaching and training, but gradually step back as youth take up leadership. I was flabbergasted in one of the programs we studied. The adult leaders helped youth learn strategic skills by first giving them a bunch of white cards and having them list everything that go wrong, and then giving them another set of white cards and have them think up solutions. And they internalized that whole procedure, as well as became more adroit at thinking up what the negative scenarios could be. So youth learn real-world planning skills, it appears to be, by becoming producers of their own development with scaffolding from adults, both as individuals and together as groups. Jesse.
And so the second set of action skills is knowing your target audience. I have to say this is a little awkward for me because I don't know you all really very well, and certainly not as well as you seem to know each other from all that I can gather. So I'm going to go off of my own experience in community organizing and places I've been. Within community organizing, there's an expression that the action is in the reaction. So once your campaign goes public, what really matters is how your target audience reacts. Knowing your target audience is essential. If you're an effective community organizer, you're not going to go in front of the city council or a board without really having analyzed the position of those members. So everything that you do, who you ask to represent your group, the language and tone that's used, and the ask that you put forward is all really tailored to your target audience. And to communicate effectively with them, you really need to understand their perspective, their motives, their history, their alliances, their jargon. And so to influence their behavior, you need to understand their way of thinking, and you also need to be able to anticipate their reactions. So how do youth learn those skills? Generally, this is not taught in school. Adolescents are just beginning to develop these advanced skills for perspective taking that allow them to anticipate the reactions of others. And they learn it first with their peers and friends, and then later are able to do perspective taking more with other adults like teachers. Youth leadership programs often offer these opportunities for teens to get more experience in these kinds of skills. Shirley Heath was describing how youth had learned to use the right vocabulary and the right register in order to be able to really strategically communicate with reporters and officials and others. And we've found that in some programs that they learn skills to anticipate and influence the reactions of children and their peers. So just as one example of how youth are learning these skills, and this isn't a perfect community organizing example, but we're working with a youth empowerment program in a rural Illinois town called Project U. And they were contacted by the local public health official and from the public health department, And the official asked them if they would be willing to disseminate the findings of a survey. There's a CDC youth risk survey that all the youth in that county and several counties had taken. And that would include giving a presentation to the local area high school students about what this survey found. And the official that was working with the youth group had already done presentations like this in the past with adults in the area, and came to the first meeting with the youth with a PowerPoint full of charts and graphs that she had used to communicate these points, and suggested maybe, hey, you can use these. Well, the youth, they immediately sensed that this approach could totally backfire, that it may not resonate with the motives of their audience, the language and ways of thinking of their audience. This was discussed, in the previous panel about sniffing out a spokesperson for an adult audience versus something that's authentically coming from youth themselves. And so, they spoke up and said, we don't think this is going to work. And the adults were a little taken aback, but they gave the youth clearance to go ahead and, figure it out on their own and, again, be agents of their own development. And so the youth recognized that their task was to hold their audience attention and make it fun while still really having a frank discussion about what the data were saying. They did a lot of repeatedly asking themselves the question, how would our audience react to this? What would lead them to the kind of reaction we want? Could we use shock value in our findings? What if we used humor? Could that send the wrong message? And through that process, through a lot of brainstorming, critiquing, getting feedback from each other, they were really able to re-message the health department's original sort of package from let's tell the kids about risky behaviors to, we all took this survey and here's what we think we should be really proud of that we're really improving on, and here's some things that we can all work on. So they used a comedy skit, they used a vivid PowerPoint with, a music video in it, and really did a lot of great work. So it was a success, and they also used their insider voice, an us voice. So, but most importantly, working on their own, they were able to develop their own set of skills for really knowing and communicating with their target audience.
So our central point is that effective civic action requires development of a toolbox of sophisticated skills. These skills involve creativity, abilities to forecast the dynamics of the real world, anticipate how other people think and react. We've mainly focused on cognitive skills. A full treatment might include some of the hardball skills that Saul Alinsky describes for dealing with conflicts, racism, catch-22s, and corruptions. Those for fighting for open space in California. How do youth learn these skills? Judy Torney-Perta found that students in the US and most nations are taught how governments are supposed to work, not how they actually work. They learn nothing about local government and institution, nor how to influence them. But even if schools got it right, there's a question of whether civic action skills can be learned in a classroom format. We argue that youth need real-world experiences to develop and practice these skills, learn them in complex contexts, and develop the accompanying moral and emotional sensibilities, judgment, courage, determination. They need to have experience as agents, brainstorming and critiquing like the youth in Project U, to act and learn on their own. So there's a lot more for us to learn about this, but we think this is an important topic. Youth need to develop skills, not only to imitate what was done before, but also to develop civic strategies and skills for the changing nature of the 21st century communities, forms of communications, forms of networking, and for new emerging problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we have Connie Flanagan, who is a professor in the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research concerns young people's theories of the social contract, or their views about the rights and responsibilities that bind members of society together. And I think when we think about youth civic engagement and studying this domain, she's certainly somebody who comes to mind. Her talk today is titled Community Service, Enlarging Youth's Sense of the Public and Perspective on the Common Good. So let's welcome Connie.
Thanks, Joanna. So I just hit the green button, right, to make things work. Let me start by saying I'm really not an expert in service. There are a lot of people that study this much better than I do. And adding to that, I want to make several points. Mostly when people hear the terms like youth civic engagement, they think it's non-controversial. After all, it's not like drug use, like it's a good thing, right? So it means that anybody would buy into it. In fact, it is controversial how you do it, okay? The Corporation for National Community Service, actually, in the most recent Congress, has really had to fight to keep Learn and Serve America, which is the K-12 programming, and AmeriCorps funding in place, okay? So it's not without controversy. Furthermore, the legislation that enables service specifically says you can't do anything political. I mean, you might consider that slightly contradictory, but in fact, you can do service in any of these federally funded programs, but you better not raise political issues in the process of doing it. It is also controversial. I mean, I actually have some problems with service because I think a lot of it speaks to solving our problems by doing charity. And we got to be really careful about that as a solution to the social issues that we have to deal with. It also means that often privileged kids are working in disadvantaged communities, which can have positive or negative benefits for both groups. So I don't mean to say in this presentation that it's a good idea without controversy. It's also the case that political scientists, not all of them, but some political scientists have critiqued the whole idea of voluntary service because when you ask young people, they actually feel fairly effective when they do voluntary service, whereas they feel fairly ineffective in the electoral arena, which many of you may sometimes feel as well. So I want to add all those caveats before I make the case that I think there's reasons to stick with what the potential of service is for enlarging kids' sense of community and enlarging their passions about what we ought to do about public problems, okay? One last caveat, and that is service can be done really poorly and it can be done really well. There's a fairly good literature on ways to make it work better, but I won't go into that today. I just simply want to say I'm not making the message that all service is perfect. I am saying, however, that there's something about service. Jess just talked about knowing your target audience in civic activism. Having to think of the perspectives of others, okay, groups that you are not familiar with and people with whom you don't interact is not a common occurrence in most of our lives, let alone in adolescents' lives, okay? So my main argument here is that the unique potential of community service is that it is a rare occasion in which young people are interacting with what contact theory and social psychology would say are members of stereotype groups. So it has the potential of A, breaking down stereotypes because you actually meet people who you don't usually interact with, and B, see the world from their perspective, okay? Let me just add a couple other things. Why this is so important is that the lives of kids today are actually more racially segregated, more economically segregated. Neighborhoods are more segregated, and as Robert Garcia told us earlier, even schools, particularly in urban areas, are more racially segregated than they were before Brown versus Board. So it's not the case that natural encounters will mean that adolescents will have opportunities to interact with people who are different from them. Now, I realize there's lots of ways in which people are different, but service means you are typically working with people who are members of stereotype groups. Okay, let me go to the next slide, if this will work. There, okay. So these are my main points, that heterogeneous encounters, that is with people who are different from us, help us to question group stereotypes, okay? They expand our notions of who it is, are we the people, okay? That's not something we sit around and talk about, that is in our founding documents, okay? So that young people can not just develop interest-based politics with people who share their interests, but can have a broader notion of collective identity and what we should think about when we think about public problems. And you hear a lot out of studies of service of kids beginning to say, I never thought about problems that way, or have a really larger sense of the moral community, okay? So I use this because I used it actually in our earlier project on prevention as a social responsibility. I think what we need to be thinking about is getting away from the concept that there are good kids and there's a bad crowd, okay? And I use this now to say, we all carry around stereotypes of who the other is, and the other is lots of different groups. And until we spend time with them and understanding the world from their perspective, we will live with those sort of stereotypes. So I'm arguing that we need a larger perspective of who others are and that there isn't a bad crowd out there. Now I'm going to report on two studies very briefly. One is a study in which we basically added some questions to another survey. This was not a study of service. We basically asked kids what kinds of extracurricular activities they were engaged in, what kinds of community-based clubs they were in, what did they ever do volunteer work, okay, and what did they learn, if they learned anything from that. So this first study is looking at just selections of the answers of those kids and trying to make my case that voluntary service enables kids to have a different perspective of others in their community than the more homogeneous, interest-based, discretionary type activities, okay? This was in diverse communities and with kids from different backgrounds. So just a few of the statements that they said. So this first is a quote. Basically, you get to know people, what you learn from your service. You get to know people for who they are, not what they are. These are the verbatim statements of kids. I used to be afraid of the elderly. It never had occurred to me that the elderly were a stereotype group. It had never occurred to me. And we got statement after statement after statement of kids saying, I was afraid of, how could you be afraid of the elderly? I was astonished at this sort of thing. I mean, we got lots and lots of statements like that. I used to be afraid of them, I understand them now, and I found out they really are nice people, okay? And they have a lot to share. Also, people are a lot friendlier and kinder than they are made out to be. And people are different, but they don't have to be an outcast. So these are some of their just statements. And I put underneath who said those things, so you get an idea of the diversity of these kids. Now, the second thing I want to raise here, this is really sort of a developmentalist saying to political scientists, you know, voting behavior may be the ultimate dependent variable that you have, but you know, some of us know something about the precursors to those sorts of things. And because they've argued that the problem with service is that it substitutes for the electoral arena. And I don't think there's actually really good evidence of that. But when you listen to some of these statements, for me, it's saying that kids are actually enlarging their notions of what are public problems through this service. So it says, it's helped me to see just how hard it can be for some kids and some adults with disabilities, okay? Some kids have more and bigger problems than others, and I see what people get angry about. I mean, for me, that's actually suggesting that they understand, you know, things like Occupy Wall Street or whatever else. Why would people be mad about the situation? And here, these sorts of statements speak to me about kids saying we have actually responsibilities to one another. Okay, there are ties that bind us to one another. So they said, I learned you should always give help, because it probably will be there when you want it back. Or I was able to get closer to people in school and realize that they were Bonnie was right, it's really hard to read these. that when you work together, that realize that team efforts make a difference. Okay, I'll read it up here. Volunteering helps me bond with others. They help me see myself. This was actually a Native American young woman whose volunteer service was to go out and educate about her Native peoples. But she basically says, I bonded with them and I actually learned a lot more about myself. And that there are nice, considerate people out there that could still believe someone after they have done wrong. I want to just mention here that this happened to be a young man who was working in an ex-convicts rehab center, but service is used in the restorative justice movement as well as a way, to speak to the last panel, as a way to change kids' reference groups, okay? I'm gonna speed up a little bit here, okay? Quickly, I just want to say, this is my slide to say that kids' perceptions of their communities will vary depending on the kinds of interactions they have with these communities. So these are scales where kids report how much their communities they believe are caring, open, and effective. So there's a bunch of items, that ask them that. And the only point I want to make with this slide, it's a very simple point. So the three things are caring, effective, and open communities, is that the neither group does neither clubs nor volunteer work, and they have the lowest positive perceptions of their communities. The clubs only group does some sort of extracurricular clubs, but compared to the volunteer groups, their perceptions of their communities are still not as positive, let's say, okay? And I think one thing we've missed in the service literature is that most of the time when you're doing service, you're doing it in human service organizations where people who staff them aren't getting rich. They're doing it because they actually believe in what they're doing. They believe in having a broader community. So that one thing that volunteer projects can do is not just enable you to connect with people in need, but also with people who've dedicated their lives to that kind of service. Okay, so that was the slide I had before, and so this is my argument about what we need to be doing in civic engagement and actually in a lot of youth development, and that is building a larger sense of solidarity with people who are different. So essentially all these kids are saying, let the dog in, he's one of us, okay? Let him into the movie theater. And we've found a lot in our work that feelings of solidarity with others are highly related to kids' social trust, wanting to contribute to their communities. I'm gonna end with two slides here. This is the second study that we've been doing, and for those of you in the audience who are used to fancy structural equation models, I actually asked the grad student to please take out all of these are latent constructs, so I asked him to take out all the extra arrows. So this sort of simplifies the story, which he found was a complicated story. These are analyses that the Corporation for National, these are data that the Corporation for National and Community Service collected. They're over 8 years. People who serve in AmeriCorps and those who, a comparison group who looked into it but then didn't serve. So all I'm showing you here is elements of the programs, okay? My AmeriCorps experience, in my AmeriCorps experience, I felt this, okay? These things happen. Elements of the programs that are related to increases in this AmeriCorps group over the year in civic engagement, okay? So what you see in the first thing is there are time 1 civic engagement reports, and these are lots of different variables. And then in the yellow box, the time 2 report. And the main thing I want to emphasize here is that their reports that I worked with teams from diverse backgrounds is the strongest predictor that they actually, over that year, became more committed to doing something to fix our problems. Okay, there were other things, but that's the one I want to point out. The one other thing I want to say, and this refers to Steve Hamilton's and Mary Agnes Hamilton's work, is that these were young adults. AmeriCorps, as you know, is like available to all age groups after 18 and up. It actually is a huge program to deal with what Mary Agnes and Steve talk about structural lag in the transition to adulthood. So there are a lot of people who work in AmeriCorps who did not go to college, some who didn't finish high school. So I think we actually should be thinking about national service as a developmental opportunity for incorporating groups who are otherwise are left out because, as Steve and Mary Agnes have said, the institutions aren't there for certain groups. Just two more points. This is Jean Bethke Elstein is a political scientist who is actually quite a conservative person, but she actually argues that what we need to be developing in people of all ages is democratic dispositions. That is, that you know where you stand on things, but you're open-minded and are able to listen to where other people stand and enlarge your perspectives and work together with them to find common ground. And I'll just finish because I had to find, since I read that Thomas Jefferson that he was president of this university, but not president of the United States on his tombstone. So obviously he cared a lot about this institution, and I looked for quotes that came close to the points I wanted to make. So he really clearly emphasized equal rights, not special privileges, friendships across divisions, and the last quote actually sounded to me a little more like Abby Hoffman, but Thomas Jefferson said it. Do you want to know who you are? Don't ask, act. Actions will delineate and define you. Thanks.
Thank you, Connie. Up next, we have a group who's visiting us here from Colorado. I'll start by introducing Benkirchner, who's an assistant professor in educational psychology and adolescent development at CU Boulder School of Education. His research examines learning environments that enable youth to exercise social and political agency, including organizing, student voice, and participatory action research. With support from the Spencer Foundation, he's currently collaborating with high school teachers to study processes of civic development by engaging students in critical civic inquiry and action research. And he's actually brought some of those students with him. So he'll be joined by Adam York, who's a third-year doctoral student in educational psychology and learning sciences. In addition, Ariel Hernandez is here. He's a senior at Abraham Lincoln High School in Denver, Colorado. And finally, Devontae Moss is a junior at Aurora Central in Aurora, Colorado. And both Ariel and Devontae have participated in critical civic inquiry and are here to share some of their experiences. So they will be talking about what schools can do to promote young people's civic learning and development. So let's welcome them.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. Thanks so much for coming to our talk. Yeah, we're going to talk about a project that we've developed to engage young people in critical civic inquiry. And today's talk will discuss our approach and share some recommendations that we've developed in collaboration with students who participated in a summer institute this past summer. And we do present today as a group in part to exemplify some of the values that guide critical civic inquiry, what we call CCI, which include youth-adult partnerships, the importance of local knowledge, particularly when thinking about interventions, and the idea of diversity as a resource for learning, just to name a few values. I'm going to say a few things about what I bring to this project. The seeds of my own involvement emerged in graduate research that I did in the Bay Area. I studied organizations where youth of color were taking actions to address problems, and this kind of youth activism, as far as I could tell, wasn't represented in the research literature. And I approached the study of these groups from the perspective of learning science and adolescent development. As suggested in these images, we see youth being invited to play meaningful public roles, perhaps as watchdogs monitoring environmental polluters in the upper right-hand corner there, or as experts in school reform, which is what that pamphlet and down below suggests. And a couple other qualities of these groups, they really invite young people to understand and change systems. And that's something that Reed and Jesse talked a little bit about, that focus on systems. There's an interest in inviting young people to change their context and their environment rather than merely be objects of services or be kind of beneficiaries of services. And then lastly, if we had more time to talk, we could talk about the academic skills that are involved with these projects. So you see the young man up there holding binoculars because he's collecting data to monitor pollution in a brownfield, and students here doing surveys. So having done some of that research, one thing that I should comment on is that these were all in after-school or out-of-school programs, community programs. My colleagues, Shelley Zion and Carlos Hipólito Delgado, wanted to try to understand what it would take to nurture these kinds of opportunities inside of schools and school classrooms. And we are concerned, and this goes back to Rich Lerner's presentation, to echo some of what he said, that the civic and the human development mission of the schools has really fallen by the wayside. And we're troubled by evidence showing that schools serving lower income families have fewer opportunities for deliberation and high quality civic learning. That's research by Kahn and Middow. So I'll say a couple things about some of the work we do. The goal here is to create sustained and systemic opportunities for students to ask critical questions about their schools and participate in efforts to improve them. And I'll highlight that what that looks like from the standpoint of a student is some sequence of an early part looking at systems and understanding self within systems and the ability to ask critical questions about those systems. Doing some kind of research, data collection and analysis, depending on what kind of project is chosen. Could be interviews, could be surveys, could be other kinds of photo voice. And then culminating in an action, which we're trying to really focus on dialogues between students and teachers, because we feel there's often a real communicative divide between adults and students. And these projects this year are happening in all kinds of classes, middle school to high school, literacy to biology, and civics. They're not all civics classes. So we completed year one last spring, and I'll just show a couple images. These images are from a culminating event held at CU Boulder, where students presented their work with each other at CU Boulder campus. After year one, we started a summer institute. We got a small amount of funding from a University of Colorado grant that essentially would give students a chance to develop more advanced civic engagement skills, those who are interested. And they pursued a question, what makes an excellent learning environment? And interviewed college students, peers, family members, and then presented recommendations and findings to teachers to kind of focus on this question of what makes an excellent learning environment. And doing this Summer Institute was also for us a chance to researchers to really iterate our understanding or to develop our understanding of what it means to organize learning environments like this. And that last comment is just to say that as we do this work with students, we're simultaneously really studying it and trying to systematically answer research questions about student learning, about classroom processes that promote learning, and the role of ecological context, which we see playing out really differently in different schools that we work with. We will sometimes talk about adopting a design-based model for our research, which is a way of developing theory from engagement in practice. And it's common in the learning sciences, ways of kind of having some hunches, trying them out, seeing what you learn, but really developing your understanding in the context that you're trying to theorize from. And to do it in a way that's in collaboration with people in the schools and with the students. So at the moment, we're in the middle of data collection for year two, and we're analyzing data. In today's talk, like some of the others, certainly Reed mentioned this, we don't present polished findings at this point, but instead a combination of recommendations from the Summer Institute and examples from last year's data. And so for today, we are focusing on what schools can do to promote civic learning and development. And we're really essentially trying to figure out what kinds of classroom and school level conditions promote the kinds of activities you see on the left there and less of what's happening on the right in that picture. And that's really the question that we've been talking about with each other in planning this talk and in general in our work. I think it's now time to turn it over to you, Adam. If y'all want to come up here.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to be talking with y'all today about teaching civics in engaging ways. And we're drawing on some of the preliminary findings from our data from year one, like Ben said. And we want to be explicit that we draw on notions of apprenticeship learning, common in learning sciences and sociocultural theory, to conceptualize what we mean by engaging learning environments. So apprenticeship learning is a process where experts model and coach novices and then fade back to allow the novices to become experts. And these learning opportunities are often centered around a task that is meaningful and authentic to the learners, and the content learned becomes a tool to achieve some kind of tangible goal. Okay, so one of the typical features of apprenticeships is that there are shared goals across the group. So students are more likely to be engaged with the learning environments when the goals are clear and attainable. And also, in the case of group projects, the group's more likely to be engaged when everybody in the group has provided some input into framing those goals. So though the goals are ideally shared, the roles can be distributed and differentiated amongst the group. This means that when working towards some shared goal, the tasks can be divided, allowing smaller groups to pursue certain things that they might be more motivated to research. Another principle is that engaging learning environments are saturated with tools and expertise. One example of this would be having many technological tools available in the classroom, such as computers and voice recorders and digital cameras, but also having experts on hand to mentor and provide assistance when needed. And then finally, having trajectories that are visible and accessible. And this happens when the learner can see what it means to become an expert or a full member in the domain, or develop an identity within the domain. So students should be able to have access to people who have become experts, and then also learn the paths that they have taken to become experts. All right, with these principles in mind, I'd like to draw on some of the data from our CCI project to illustrate the ways in which schools can teach civics in engaging ways. Now, I want to make it clear that our goal is not only to focus on the successes that we've experienced, but also to unpack some of the dilemmas and challenges that we're experiencing in the work that we do. Oh, yeah. So one thing we're seeing in our data is that students really engage with civics when it's framed as learning how to become agents of change. So for example, the CCI Summer Institute folks who you saw a slide of, they identified particular sets of skills, such as improvising when someone asks them a difficult question, or critically analyzing media and texts, as important skills that they wanted to learn but did not get an opportunity to do in school. Learning about systems can be a key component of this process, but the emphasis on applied work allows students to exercise agency while developing into competent civic actors. Another example is that throughout this project, we've learned lessons about the benefits of connecting the work that's going on in schools with what's happening outside of schools. So students have said that they gain important insights by connecting their work in the classroom to what's happening in the social movements and organizations that are doing stuff around their schools and in the communities nearby. So if students don't have ties with these organizations, schools can adopt models that get students connected with work that's relevant to their civic learning that's already happening in the community. An example from the CCI project included bringing in a nonprofit from outside the school who had a lot of expertise in the school lunch reform movement, who was able to inform students about the strategies and history of the movement which they were interested in enacting in their own school. And then finally, teachers and administration can support students' critical thinking by finding ways to create a supportive context for students to ask critical questions. An example of an unsupportive context from the CCI study was when a teacher was reluctant to engage in conversations about racial discrimination happening at the school. So when these conversations are pushed to the boundaries, the students don't have an audience for their grievances, and they may become discouraged from participating in efforts to change their school.
All right, so I'm gonna start off with a story of how I joined CCI and everything. So 2 years ago, I was personally not a civically engaged student as I am today. What got me motivated is the simple class of CCI. CCI allowed me to learn how to identify issues in my school and my community and what could be done to solve them, such as the issue of high school, of college awareness in high school, on trying to get into a college that you want to. I found it very interesting to learn what other people were thinking about certain issues, so I decided to move forward and take some action for a change. This past summer of 2011, I joined the CCI Summer Institute to take what we have learned inside the classroom and use it outside of school. Our main question at the Institute was, what was essential for education? At the end of the Institute, we presented to some student teachers at CU Denver, seeing how well the teachers responded to and how they were influenced by how we presented our information. Got me thinking, what about making statewide changes in all of Colorado? So my friends invited me to a meeting one day for an organization called Padres and Jóvenes Unidos. It's a youth-led organization that fights for youth justice in Colorado. So after going to the meeting, I decided that Padres was perfect for me and that I would continue working with them for as long as I could. The point of this whole story is to show you how one simple class and the invitation by my friends influenced me to get where I am today. And the key message is that students need to be invited to participate in meaningful ways. We won't always find those ways ourselves. So that being said, I want to start off showing how we can invite people with inside a classroom first. So we can build interest through presentations about issues relevant to the students, such as students who are already involved in some kind of activity to be given the chance to give their presentation whenever there is some spare class time. Second is whole school policies that bring students to the table. So who is the student council inside of schools, right? Most of the time it's small groups of students chosen by their classmates based on popularity. So well, we think that who governs the school should be all of the students instead of concentrating the power into just one small group. Also, decisions should be more than what the theme for prom should be. And yeah, and students should be able to give input on things like uniforms, school lunches, and school policies. There are also times when schools limit the opportunities for some students. For example, last year, we had a field trip to CU Boulder to present our civic projects to each other. Because of policies at the schools, students who had a low GPA were not able to go. So they missed out on the experience of being or seeing what it feels like to be a college student. The next thing is outside of school. So what about having kids join organizations as an exchange, and in exchange they would get credit for academic credit for their participation. So I really think some students would like that to be real for more organizations, just because they're too busy with school to actually get time to be in the organization. So if they had credit, they would be able to join it whenever they wanted to. So as an example, I would like to use the Padres, the organization I'm part of. They use they go ahead and have meetings inside of school and during lunch, whenever there's free time, just to not interrupt the learning time for the school.
I go to Aurora Central High School, and I think people should take students serious because administration doesn't have all the ideas how to run a school without student input. The people that are in charge of the school need students because we do have good ideas. And one day we might have their job. So examples of not taking students seriously is I've been there when my friends have been told by teachers that they'll never make it or they won't graduate from high school and they won't make it in the real world. And that was the example when I haven't saw anyone taken serious. And something that goes on at Aurora Central High School that makes me think that students don't be taken serious is when you don't hear about student council. For example, I just heard about student council 2 weeks ago when I had a meeting with Adam. An example of being taken serious is when I was in the student summer institute with them, and we made a PowerPoint, and it made me feel like I had power. And we talked about student voice and showed it to the student teachers. And I have a quote from a teacher, and it says, "It was shocking to hear how even students are aware of the flaws in our school systems, and if students care so much, then teachers should also."
To conclude, we do want to recognize the challenges faced in schools, but also really the possibilities they represent. Unlike community organizations, we found that schools are often burdened by certain structures and norms that can end up unintentionally or sometimes intentionally restricting many students from practice in the habits of civic life. But at the same time, we're hopeful, and we've seen the potential of compelling classroom activities that invite a broad spectrum of students to think critically and develop a sense of collective voice. And we look forward to sharing our learning as we continue to collect data from this project about what schools can do to promote civic learning. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. If you were here this morning for Rich Lerner's talk, then the name of our final panelist will be familiar to you because it was mentioned several times throughout that talk. John Zaff is the Vice President of Research and Policy Development at the America's Promise Alliance. He's also a Research Associate Professor in the Department of Child Development and a Senior Fellow in the Jonathan Tisch College of Citizenship and Public Service at Tufts University. His research focuses primarily on examining how young people navigate through and are influenced by their communities, particularly with regard to academic achievement and civic engagement. And today he'll be talking about connecting disconnected youth, benefits for our communities and our democracy. So welcome, John.
Thank you. Since Rich already kind of teed me up, I'm sure my expectations are high. I will try to lower them as soon as possible. What I've learned, there's truisms in life. I've learned a couple over time, especially about public speaking. I had the experience back in '04. I had founded a nonprofit called 18 to 35 that was focused on what we said, getting out the voice of young people. The whole idea was that young people needed to be involved in the policy process. We had this big launch event with various other organizations around the election, and I had the great pleasure of having a hip-hop reverend speak before me. So one truism is never speak after a hip-hop reverend. The second truism is never speak after youth. They clearly are going to talk much more eloquently about the issues that affect them than I ever could. So I want to mention that truism. I also mentioned the organization that I founded and that was thankfully merged with another much more successful organization, which makes me now look much more successful, because all the conversations then, and they've not changed, was always about the low-hanging fruit around civic engagement. That it was always about, we're going to start there, and by low-hanging typically meant highly advantaged youth. We'll get them engaged first, and then we'll move on. And we never ever seem to get to that higher hanging fruit. And I think that's been something consistent, and that only more recently have people like Connie, Peter Levine, and others started to talk about more disengaged youth and how they can become engaged, and that this civic gap we have in this country. So I come at this from a more than just civic engagement, but really engagement in life perspective, with the overarching idea that to be engaged civically, you have to be engaged in life, right? And how can you be engaged in your community and engaged in the issues of your community if you don't see yourself connected to that community? How can you act civically toward the issues of your country if you don't feel connected to your country? You could clearly turn that around and say, how could you be connected to your academics and your work if you don't feel connected civically? And great organizations like Youth Build, who you'll hear from tomorrow, Core Network and others take a wonderful approach with that. So this is also important about engagement because if you imagine in a country where the largest urban centers are also home to dropout rates that come close to 50%, in some places 75% in high school, which again sometimes is a striking statistic, but that's true. If you even go to some smaller cities, it can even be worse. Indianapolis, Detroit, when Boston, where I'm from, is hailed as a model because you've hit 60% graduation rates, there's a problem, right? But now flip that a little bit and say, okay, but who's now advocating for those young people? Are they themselves? That 40% in Boston, that 50% other places, the 75% in Detroit? They're not. And even when youth are engaged in those conversations, typically it's not those 40%, 50%, 75%. It's usually those who are actually doing pretty well get involved in those authentic discussions when it actually happens with the policymakers, with decision makers, with administrators. These are the young people who get left behind clearly. So that's what I want to talk about today, is why it's a benefit for them, why it's a benefit for the community, and why it's a benefit for the country. So as a quick outline, I'm going to discuss some civic engagement trends to look at gaps in civic engagement, talk quickly about why we should even care. I mean, it pulls in the heartstrings a little bit, but you have to do a little bit more than that. So I'll talk about why we should care. And then talk about how. So you'll hear I know, a great presentation tomorrow about Youth Build. I'm going to talk about a local level example in what's called a gateway city in Massachusetts, in Lowell, Massachusetts, a great organization there, and then give some examples. Now, interestingly, I was called over, you might have seen, right over there, while others were speaking, and told that my last 3 slides were corrupted. Those happen to be the last 3 slides, which were my examples. So, thankfully, I was able to capture them on my smartphone, and I can now speak to them. To provide illustrations, I will do an interpretive dance of those examples. There you go. My running man will floor you at 5:30 in the evening. So, moving forward. So, the illustration. So, you probably will not be able to see these numbers. Oh, no, actually you can. Those are pretty big. So, what you'll see here are trends over the past, let's say, 30-odd years, 36 years, from 72 to 2008. You'll see similar patterns, actually, regardless of educational attainment, right? So you see dips and dips and dips, and then an increase later on. Lowest line is those who did not complete high school, and then up from there. So those who completed high school, nothing more, some college, and a BA or more. So clearly, our attempts to engage the more advantaged seems to be maybe, I don't want to say not a worthwhile cause, but if you're going to put your resources from a policy perspective where the need is, you might not want to go with the college-educated cohort, right? The college-going, right? I think they've kind of got it. Yeah. We struggle with this actually at Tufts University is how do you actually measure the value add for that highest level, right? And that's something we're struggling with. And I actually should point out quickly, Michelle Boyd, raise your hands up in the air, maybe 2 hands there, Michelle, there you go. She's a co-author on this poster, on this presentation, and will actually be presenting on issues of measurement next in 2 weeks on it for a separate conference. So you can talk to her about all the measurement issues. So clearly, I don't know what happened in 2000. You can have your own thoughts. Al Gore lost his personality. George W. Bush, you bring it to yourself. So, but clearly, you know, if you look at those who dropped out of high school, I mean, how often do you get close to 0 in a rate, right? But there you go, barely anybody engaged. Up to an astounding 26%, which is a quarter of what it is, almost, you know, virtually a quarter of what it is or a third of what it is for the higher groups. This will be a consistent trend. Next, this is for midterm elections. Not surprisingly, everybody's lower, typical of midterm election results. You have lower rates across the board. Again, 9.4% in the most recent midterm. This is after a time when we were supposed to be re-engaged as a country, right? Remember, Obama becomes elected. We're a civically actualized country again, and you know, so this is where we are, right? So 9%, a quarter of what it is for the top, a third of what it is for those who have at least a little college. Moving on. Volunteer rates by educational attainment. I take complete responsibility for the lack of labels on this one. The other 2 were brilliantly put together by Circle, right? I tried my hand at putting together a PowerPoint slide, not very successful. I do not have those skills needed, clearly, for the 21st century. I can't even put labels for codes. So I will guide you through. Again, it's consistent. Lowest bar is high school dropouts, then high school graduates, no more, little college, and college graduates. Again, as you see, fewer than 10% of those without a high school diploma actually volunteer. And this is, the metric is at least once in the past 12 months. This is not a high bar, right? So a lot of times now, those of us who do civic research actually want to be a little more ambitious and say, you know, how many of those did it once per month, multiple times per month? This is just once per year, less than 10%, right, according to current population survey data. Again, and if you look at the disparities, again, it's that 1/4, 1/3, right? So again, consistent there. So then, actually, I'll pull back for a second. So then, that's just talking about educational attainment. But as we all know, these are not homogeneous groups. Amazing heterogeneity within those groups. And so to say you don't have a high school diploma, clearly you're at risk. We can, you know, I can show you all the data. You probably all have the data that shows if you don't have a high school diploma, your chances of success, more or less however you want to define it, you don't have as good of a chance of attaining that. Now let's get that fun a little narrower. So oftentimes when we want to look about does engagement beget engagement in a population, right, which is what I'm talking about here. To be engaged in one aspect of your life, you should probably need to be engaged in another aspect first. It's kind of hard because it's all conflated, because you're typically dealing with a pretty engaged population to begin with, right? Those who actually complete surveys, typically, right? So what if we then are able to look at a cohort of young people who are disengaged, disconnected? That enables us then to see really then what our leverage points are there. Because if we can then show if we engage them in one aspect of their life, it leads to other things, we can be a little more concrete about knowing this dynamic. So let's talk about proven risk youth, right? We're not talking about at risk, we're talking about proven risk. Proven risk youth. So 9% of youth 16 to 19 are disconnected, right? Not in school, not working, disconnected youth. Some people use some different phrasing, but disconnected according to Kids Count. Approximately 1 million gang members in the United States. This is a very rough number. I've been looking for data that actually breaks this down by age. I have not found any. If you have any, please let me know. Collaboration, right? In time, so just yell it out. But if not, approximately 1 million, these clearly skew toward, clearly skews toward younger sets, especially in street gangs, right? 1.6 million annual delinquency cases, 93,000 in detention centers. This does not include those who are out of centers or have just been engaged in some way with juvenile justice. So why should we care? Quickly go through this, right? If we're going to solve the problems in this country, especially of those who are being impacted by these problems, we have to get those people engaged. We see this time and again in history, whether it's the immigrants in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Polish, Italian, Eastern European Jews, were considered to be full of deficits, right? There were groups that when given opportunities and really when creating opportunities for themselves were able to really make change for themselves and for the country. African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement as a clear proof point there, made the opportunities for themselves to create more opportunities for both them as a population, but also as a country. More recently, you can look at the Hispanic community and the DREAM Act and the organizing that went around that, right? So you have typically historically disenfranchised groups that actually create their own opportunities to go against the system and, as was mentioned before, not just go with what the system is supposedly supposed to do. From an individual level, non-participation begets non-participation, right? And that means also for their kids, we clearly see a socialization component here. It's a critical period during youth for political and civic socialization. And we know that also not only do the 5 C's lead to a 6th C, but the 6th C also leads to the 5 C's. And so it goes both ways. So quickly about what I'm talking about engagement. When I talk about civic engagement, I'm not talking about civic behaviors solely. So just because you are acting and doing something does not mean you're engaged in it, right? So this is one attempt at thinking about a broader construct that included connection, included an emotional component, to put it all together. And what we've shown in research that we've done with Michelle back there, wave your hands again, we've shown that there are different trajectories for different aspects of civic engagement. Jim Eunice talks about this. He takes from the cognitive perspective, saying we have to get out of the mind. So we have to get out of intention and into action. I would add on to that and just say we also have to get solely out of action and get into intention, right, for deeper engagement. So when we look at that, this is what we looked at, a combination of civic duty and participation as one construct. We did trajectory analysis, so these are trajectory memberships. We see different trajectories that occur. This is not from a disengaged group. This is from the 4-H study of positive youth development, which you heard about before, much more advantaged group. We then looked at school engagement, again, similar different trajectories. What becomes a little more interesting is when you put them together. So we did dual trajectory analysis to look at the development of those trajectories together. And what we find is, maybe not completely surprising, is that if you're not engaged, you're not engaged. If you are engaged, you are engaged. But not everybody's a golden child, so if you are engaged, you might only be moderately engaged in the other, so there are some nuances. But a big takeaway for us here is get somebody engaged in some aspect of their life to get them engaged in other aspects of their life. For me, from a civic perspective, you will not find you will not find relevance in the work you are doing if you're not engaged in your life. I can talk more about that, but I know my time is limited. Those bright orange signs. So quickly, a local example. Lowell, Massachusetts, very high poverty rate. You can read for yourself. Overall gestalt kind of picture here is, right, low income, disadvantaged, disenfranchised community, historically. Here comes the United Teen Equality Center. Their mission is to ignite and nurture the ambition of Lowell's most disconnected youth. Really what they're doing here is getting at the most disconnected youth in the community to transform the lives of those youth and to transform the community. Youth development is indeed community development here, right? Founded in '99 by youth, for youth, right? And currently serves 1,900 youth more broadly, but now they have a specific focus on 100 youth who are proven risk. They are school dropouts and gang involved, criminally involved, and or homeless. So clearly proven risk. They do 3 years of intensive curricula with these youth around case management, workforce development, education, and social justice as a vein that goes through it all. They start on the street with street workers, bringing youth in gangs into the center. And so you're not talking about a lot of self-selection, and I'll quickly wrap it up. But importantly, they were pushed hard when they brought in a consultant, which is always the death knell for anything thoughtful. They brought in a consultant who pushed them not to include civic engagement as a focal outcome to hold themselves accountable to. And because they're so passionate about this, they pushed back and said, yes, civic engagement. They do things such as Vote 17, which has been the most successful campaign to lower the voting age to 17 in the country. It's currently being held up in the state legislature, but has progressed further than any other attempt in the country. They also hold their own hearing, own debate for council members, city council members. So that's what they do. Just want to quickly say, if you look at their outcomes, this really speaks to this idea of engagement, going from just pure stability to engaged educationally to getting their GEDs, increased employability, clearly the reduction of negative, but also the increase of the positive. They really, every single day, live and breathe the idea of productive citizens in society, and that all youth have strengths, and that all youth, regardless of their current status, have the potential to be productive citizens in society. Thank you. Oh.
All right, so I think our panelists did a wonderful job of representing the theme of the conference and sort of helping us understand forward thinking and preparing youth for the coming world. And now I invite all of you to continue to engage them with questions. So if you could please come up to a microphone if you have questions.
I'm Steve Hamilton from Cornell. Thank you to the panelists for being both inspiring and informative. I have a frustration that I've had for a long time. I think of John Dewey's book, Democracy and Education, as the foundational text in this area. He published that, if I remember correctly, in 1916. The kinds of things you were talking about and have illustrated have been and remain marginal, particularly in the public schools. One, can we move them from the margins to the mainstream? Or alternatively, should we go to community organizations outside the school to pursue these objectives, which everyone agrees are important and agrees that the kinds of ways you've talked about are the ways to achieve them. We just aren't willing to change what happens in schools to make that happen.
I'll start us off. Thank you. Thanks for the question. And it's funny because we were chatting about our talk, and at one point, one of the slides was called the New Civics or something, and that's a term that Spencer Foundation is using. And we realized it's really not a new civics. It's, going back to Dewey and before that, around an experiential and active opportunity. And it's interesting because that echoes, some discussion that I think happened at the very beginning of the day when people were talking about schools as developmental settings. And their potential and the challenges. I would just say, now being in year 2 of doing this work, I don't want to stop. So I think it's not just a worthy effort, but I see, at a small scale, a lot of great things happen at different schools. So I guess I would just answer and say I share your view that in a kind of systemic way, these are institutions that have these very old structures and norms. I had a slide I didn't show, just looking at pictures of classrooms through the century and how the general spatial organization of classrooms has stayed the same. But you know, they're such important places too, and there's also so much talent in so many schools, and there is a real energy around change that I certainly think it's worth putting our time and effort into schools, as well as looking at the out of school and hopefully creating some synergies between them. I'll just say one last thing on this, because certain researchers who identify with this learning sciences approach, when they do kind of future casting, they tend to think a lot about a decentralized, and I see Craig, who's part of the Connected Learning, Craig Watkins network from MacArthur, sort of maybe thinking about learning that's decentered from schools, but where schools still play a role. Because schools are one of the few public places that exists for young people. So new media is a privatized space often, and even these nonprofit organizations, they're public, but they often reach smaller numbers. So although the concept of a public school, I think, is under threat, it is one of the few places where people learn to be part of a public. And so if we may decentered it from its sort of heavy role right now and dominating most of the waking hours, but in playing a role in concert with other kinds of learning centers, that's a kind of movement that I think will take a lot of work, but is a promising one. I'll stop there. Anyone else on the panel want to speak to this question?
Well, I'm just going to quote Adam York. So I thought the point he made is like that what we need to do is that kids need to learn how, not just about, and that a lot of civics instruction is about. So how a bill becomes a law rather than, you know, acting on your passions and learning things. I mean, in Wisconsin, you know, like it wasn't until all of the uproar about taking away public employees' rights that we started to say, well, you know, like, what is a recall? I mean, I don't know. How do you do it? You know, how long do you have to be? Like, you don't ask those questions. I mean, it was Bush v. Gore, where when we all said, you know, like, I heard about the Electoral College. Like so a lot of knowledge that's like, you know, disconnected. I mean, it was Dewey's point. But I think we should actually look more positively at the glass half full. You know, like, 35% of high schools say they have some sort of service in practice. That wasn't true a couple decades ago, and with all its problems, it's like the normative stuff that the peer groups, like when a norm shifts, like you know, institutions think they should do it. It's also the case in our field. I mean, how many times has a panel on civic engagement been invited? Right, so like we think it's part of what we ought to talk about now. You know, a couple years ago, the World Bank did a Youth in the Developing World. They had citizenship as one of their chapters. They didn't used to do that. You know, it's always education. The population demographers think about education. They think about fertility. You know, they think about work. Well, they thought about citizenship. So I actually think, in terms of field, Steve, that institutions like high schools are starting to say that, you know, we do have a civic mission, whatever, you know, however we define it, but we do have one, and that's a norm we should hold to. And our profession is actually starting to say, maybe we should think about what are the developmental precursors of this stuff.
I think we're ready for a swing of the pendulum. I don't want to be too optimistic, but I feel the pressure is building, and as you know, the pendulum swung back and forth several times since Dewey, and I think all of us should keep pushing with counter-narratives. It's not like the current people are going to suddenly change their minds, but there's enough people in the middle that we can get with peer influence, with new narratives to swing it back away from the authoritarian to a more youth-centered, motivated model.
So Alita Meyer again from the Administration for Children and Families. Once I had the opportunity to see Maya Jamison, and she was the first African-American and female astronaut, and she talked about the important role of science education as civic, and that she stopped being an astronaut, and she has this big organization, and she feels very passionately that in order to have an informed citizenry that can make good decisions, the average citizen needs to know how to interpret statistics and not say things like, oh, you can make statistics say anything. Well, you can't if people know how to interpret, maybe you can make a headline say anything, but if people understood statistics, I don't think you can make a body of an article say anything. And so my question maybe for the high school students is, what do you think about that? And for everybody, but I guess for you guys first, about thinking of the role of pulling in science. I know science education and just the broad perspective around that, ethical decisions around DNA, and today the headlines were around patents on the DNA of body parts and things like that. What do you think about pulling that in as part of the civic engagement?
Well, I mean, if it has to do with like relevant issues that affect us, that affect the people in our community, I mean, I think that they should be brought in. Like every single factor that affects us in the community or schools or anywhere that we want to make a change, I mean, that they should come into play, right?
Have you guys been doing that? Is anybody doing that, pulling in so like, I see the natural play of this with social science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I know in my neighborhood, people have done some things around water quality.
Yeah, I can say, as this CCI project evolves into its second year, we actually are in some biology classrooms, and the intersections between participatory research and health, I mean, that's been done for a long time. People have been doing participatory research in health, but, the students are obviously really getting interested and engaged in that because those issues of health and of, just quality of life issues around their school are very important to them. And then something that also came up in our summer institute, we were talking about what are the essential things to learn. And many of the folks agreed that, just having a basic science literacy is part of being an engaged person. So I think that that's a theme that is coming up a lot in the work that we're doing.
Just one other thing to mention, which is through Learn and Serve, which is, I don't know, it's any longer here, but Learn and Serve when it was around, they funded, had several different grants to various organizations from Youth Serve America to the state of Massachusetts, where it was specifically for middle school age youth who were in at-risk settings you typically define as low income. It had to be service learning that was done in science classes. So with a bent toward the environment. So there is, I think, there actually was a focus from the federal government at least to look at that issue, which was interesting. With Circle, where I've been looking at that issue in Massachusetts. We have very preliminary data at this point. Interestingly, maybe not so surprising, is that there's not really a big push to look at how that actually influences civic engagement. It's all focused on academic outcomes from that initiative.
This way next.
I'm Judith Torney-Perta from the University of Maryland. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the evidence base and how it might inform some of the very interesting comments that were made by the panel today. As I think I said earlier, I've been part of what's called an international large-scale student assessment, which is the IEA Civic Education Study, which we did in 1999 in 28 countries. And most of what I'm going to say comes from the United States, although not all of it. Unfortunately, the U.S. did not participate the last time this survey was done, so the latest material we have is from 1999. I'd like to focus, instead of on accumulating negatives, on ways in which we accumulate positives in this field, since the topic of the conference is positive approaches. And I think that the evidence which I gained from looking at this study, at least in 3 areas, contributes to that. In the first place, it's not just service. When we look at students who, in 4 countries, who have only service, only classroom instruction about community programs, both or neither, it's very clear that the students who have both do better, and that the students who have neither do worse, or the worst. So it's this combination or synergy or connection between studying in school and doing the service that's important, so you can build on the positives by putting them together. Similarly, I think we sometimes say there was a discussion about whether it's the community or the school, and that contributes to that issue too. The second point is that sometimes we think that we have to throw out the traditional teaching, throw out the textbook, throw out the lecture, and let the students free to discuss. What we find, and we have a strong measure of the extent of traditional teaching in this study, and another measure of the extent to which there's an open classroom climate for discussion. Again, if you have both of them, you're always better off than if you have neither of them. And interestingly, on some of the outcomes like media literacy skills and intergroup attitudes toward ethnic groups, the interactive component is absolutely essential. Just hearing it said by the teacher or reading about it in the textbook isn't enough. You have to have the opportunity to actively process this kind of information. And the lecture alone is never superior to some combination with interactive. So, but it's not a question of throwing out one or the other. It's a question of trying to get the two working together. And one of the most serious difficulties in this area, in my experience, is that groups such as those that put together the Civic Mission of Schools report, which is a wonderful report and was just reissued actually under the title Guardians of Democracy, the Civic Education of the United States, is that you have the hardest time convincing these groups that student interaction, free discussion, respectful climate in the classroom is important. They say, in fact, there was a minority report the first time there was the Civic Mission of Schools from a group, a very vociferous group of people who said, the adults know what should be learned, don't turn it over to the students to discuss. And although we've known for decades that this interactive open classroom climate is important, getting that implemented, teaching teachers to use it, getting parents and others to value it, and it works for cognitive outcomes, this achievement, as well as or better sometimes than it does even for the attitudinal ones. So that's another issue. So I think that's enough, but I will always be happy to answer questions about other ways in which the evidence base we have contributes to the kinds of directions which are being discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Yeah, I find that helpful too, and I would just add that I think that contrast that you drew between a kind of an authoritarian or traditional and kind of let the children free kind of approach. I mean, I hear you when you talk about the internal debates that, you know, people are very much in different ideas around the spectrum on that. But I also would say that if you look at Reed's work or other people who have really looked inside these kinds of youth action projects, there's always a really clear recognition of the role of adults, the role of expertise, and the role of kind of learning to be part of a community that adults are part of, and a more intergenerational emphasis versus a kind of youth versus adults emphasis. So I really would want to stress that. I wouldn't want the message to be the kinds of projects we're describing are a kind of us versus them or a romantic idea about youth empowerment that's divorced from, you know, society and adult institutions. You may not have been saying that, but I just want to make that clear. Yeah.
I was referring to the people who control education in general,
okay.
not to my own view,
Right.
but to the groups who were in this, putting together this report. When those of us put forward the notion of the interaction and open classroom climate is vitally important, this other group said, no, the adults have to remain in charge. They've got to write the curriculum. Let's add a few more content standards to how many, you know, learning how many courts there are in the state of Virginia or whatever. As a matter of fact, apparently Justice Kennedy was once asked by one of his neighbors who was a young student, couldn't he help her learn more about the court system of Virginia because she had to learn how many courts there were at each level? And he said, so what is that going to teach you that you're ever going to need to know? So the point is not that I believe it's this, but that this is the fight we have to undertake, because what happens in school is in many cases in the control of people who do believe that this is the case, and that, as I say, the more standards there are, the better.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, thank you. Fascinating panel. Thank you all very much. My name is Andy Kaufman. I teach Russian literature at UVA, and with the assistance of Youth-Nex, I've helped to develop a program called Books Behind Bars, where my undergraduate students go into juvenile correctional centers to lead discussions about Russian literature. So one of the questions that your panel raised for me is that most of your examples were high school students. I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts about engaging college-level students. Are some of the patterns and issues the same? Are there other issues that would not apply to high school students? Just some general thoughts on that.
Throw a few words in. I mean, just, you know, at Tufts University, we have the Tisch College of Citizenship and Public Service, which is meant specifically, it's a non-degree granting college that really tries to tie in the idea of active citizenship throughout all schools and all departments. So the idea that Russian literature is just as good of a venue to teach those kinds of ideals as it is anywhere else. So, you know, and I think the basic ideas have been very consistent with what you hear about youth. I mean, I think these are things that, I mean, yes, the transition to adulthood is dramatically different, but when you're in an institution like a college, you definitely have the supports within that college, the adult supports, even though you are yourself an adult, to work through these ideals, the idea of reflection, the idea of analysis. I mean, those are all things I think are consistent across that. I mean, one thing that we do find is you see these transformations that do occur, and I think, Connie, the analysis you showed, I think, exemplifies that, where young people go in, they have these amazing ideals about what they know, so self-efficacy through the roof, right? And they actually go into a community, and this is part of our measurement issue, is that from a measurement perspective, we can't actually see the change. We don't have measures that are sensitive to that change. But when we do a qualitative analysis, we see dramatic shifts, transformations in how they view the community, and how they view each other, and how they view their role there. And so that's something that's not as well, I think, explored and addressed, and probably provides opportunity for greater reflection, I would think.
Very interesting, thank you.
So are you talking about the young adults, college students that you're working with? Is that who you mean by?
Well, one of the impulses behind that question was a comment that you had made, that it's difficult to identify the benefits of this experience to a group of students who are already engaged, and that's the group that I work with. So, and we're seeing engagement. So one of the issues is, how do you measure it? And then I was also just curious, generally, if you find that this kind of engagement has less efficacy with college students, the same amount of efficacy. Just your feedback on those issues.
Well, I mean, I'll start by saying, just picking up on Steve's point earlier, they say now that doing some sort of service is like a prerequisite to get into college. So like the norms have changed in terms of what we expect people to do once they get in college, which goes to John's points about are we educating the privileged for more civic engagement? But your project means that your students are interacting with people we rarely interact with, right? I mean, how many of us go to prisons? So, I mean, I mean, I was actually mindful of there was a book Doug McAdam wrote on Freedom Summer, of very privileged elite college students during the civil rights movement going to Mississippi to do voter registration. And their world, I mean, these were privileged kids and they were already committed. They couldn't believe that America was so unequal. I mean, and they already went thinking that they should register people. So I mean, one thing I think all of us would say is that this is a time when John had it up on one of his PowerPoints. This is really a sort of politically sensitive, defining moment, time in development. So the kinds of things that we expose young people to have really major opportunities for causing them to really rethink their worldviews and their ideas about injustice and what they might want to do next. So, I mean, I think the fact that you're doing it in a penal institution really is probably, but I mean, I think Judith's point also is relevant. Like, only exposing people without group reflecting it and talking it through. I'm sure you're doing that sort of a thing, but, understanding what they're going through and what it means about our justice system is probably a big next step.
And actually, there's some research that shows, particularly with male populations, if you don't do that kind of reflection, their sense of the population, their appreciation for the population actually goes down. Their stereotype goes up. And that's particularly with males. So that reflection is critical and debriefing.
Part of what you're talking about, I think, is motivation, the motivational question. And I just finished writing an article for a volume Rich put together on intrinsic motivation and positive development, and read all the literature on motivation, or a lot of literature. And the principles of motivation are kind of the same across age periods and across populations. It's like when there's something, as Adam said, that's not too hard and the rules are relatively clear, and you develop that interest, which develops over time, and you engage people with something that really matters. And if you're in prison, it might be actually in some ways easier to find some of those things that matter, even in Russian literature, certainly in Dostoevsky.
Now. Let's not be Russian literature bashing here.
No, I love it. But I mean, for me, for this conference, motivation is kind of a hard issue here. If we can get people motivated, if we can get kids turned on, whether it's in science, really learning how to do science as opposed to memorize science, whether it's about civics, getting them to do it, it can be harder and there can be more ups and downs, but it's much more motivating, and over time, they develop the capacity for sustained motivation. And the other thing, deep motivation gets you more involved at a metacognitive level. So, I think a heart of positive development is turning on that part, engaging that part of the conscious self to develop that kind of motivation. And that can occur across populations.
We have time for one more, so Karen.
It's a quick one. My name is Karen Waters Wicks, and I am the Executive Director of the Quality Community Council, a local nonprofit organization, as well as adjunct instructor of education at Piedmont Virginia Community College. Piggybacking on the question of motivation, just a really quick one for the folks at CCI and the Summer Institute. I wonder how students are recruited for the program. Do they self-select, and do they receive any compensation or academic credit for their participation? Thanks.
Do you want to answer it from your perspective, or I'll say it from my perspective, then you say it from your perspective. How about that? All right. So everybody participated during the school year who was in the classroom, and then we did recruit in last April by making announcements. We did provide a stipend, and we were very intentional about that because we wanted both to engage young people who might have to work other kinds of jobs, but also because we wanted to be doing meaningful public work that we think deserved a pay, just like we were getting paid over the summer. And it was very self-selected. So students who were interested joined, I would say.
Thank you, and thank you for a wonderful panel.
Do you want to add anything?
No. All right. Well, yeah, exactly like how Ben said. We chose to be there. I mean, if we wanted to, we could have just not gone. And since we had to apply and everything, we had to go ahead and answer some questions to get into the Summer Institute. So that's basically my point of view on it. Thank you.
So let's thank our panel, who did a great job of wrapping up the day for us.